The General Secretary of the National Education Union, Dr. Mary Bousted, joins us now. Thank you so much for being on the show. You're striking next week, which means lots of schools closing, lots of children, of course, missing out on important school days. The Education Secretary has offered to get around the table for talks. A lot of parents might be thinking, why haven't you taken her up on it?
Well, she has offered to get around the table for talks, and that is some progress. And we want to take advantage of that. We want to take her up on our offer. But she put in place an unacceptable precondition, which is that we stop the strike action before we start the talks. And given that we have been telling the government for over a year now that we are going to enter a dispute, that we've written 18 letters trying to resolve the dispute, and they have just not entered into negotiations. The negotiations we've had over the last few weeks have been parlously poor, with the Secretary of State saying there's no more money, we can't do anything. Then we have to see some progress. So we are willing to negotiate anytime, any place, anywhere. But what we can't do before we have made any progress in negotiations is call off the industrial action, which is the reason why we have got to the negotiating table. We don't want to be taking action. My members want to be in classrooms teaching pupils, this COVID generation who have lost so much, and we want to be teaching them. But they're also saying we cannot carry on with the conditions in school anymore, and we can't carry on with a workforce which is just depleted because teachers are leaving the profession and graduates don't want to join it, and that leaves schools understaffed and under-resourced. And those are not my words, those are the words of the Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman.
We've done a lot in recent months about school funding, and I absolutely take your points on board about the pressures that teachers are under and also the financial pressures too on school budgets as well. At the same time, though, I guess some people might still be thinking, well, look, I know you want to have progress before you call off the strikes, but why don't you just swallow this? Why don't you just pause the strikes in the hope that you could get a deal? I mean, that's what the government did with nurses, right? They paused strikes for talks.
Yeah. Well, we're not in the same position as the nurses, unfortunately, because what happened with them was there was a joint press release between the Royal College of Nursing and the government saying that the RCN were going to pause the strikes in favour of serious negotiations. Now, if I were General Secretary Pat Cullen of the RCN, I would not have signed that statement unless I knew in advance what the scope of the negotiations were, what the money available was to invest in the health service, invest in nurses' pay. In other words, a huge amount of groundwork had been done to give the General Secretary of the RCN the confidence in order to pause the action. None of that has been made available to the National Education Union. And it's a huge thing to ask a union to stop action, which has got the government to the table, where the government is only saying we'll enter into negotiations, and we have no idea what those negotiations will encompass. So I say again to the government, we are ready and willing to negotiate anytime, any place, anywhere. Stop the silly precondition, which we can't agree to because we have no idea what you mean by serious negotiations. Why don't you just sit around the table and get into negotiation? The sooner you do that, the sooner we can stop the strikes. And that's what we want to do.
How would you describe the talks so far with the Education Secretary? Have they been productive? Have you been encouraged by any of it?
Well, I was talking last week to a senior government official who will remain nameless, who said the talks so far have been silly.
Silly?
Yeah, silly. Just a reiteration that there's no more money available this year, that we have to fight inflation, even though public sector wages aren't driving inflation, and just so vague that, there was none of the information and none of the statements that more money would be made available in order to base serious negotiation. Now, I am very pleased that the government has said that he now wants to enter into serious negotiations. So let's do that. Let's drop the precondition, which we can't accept that we will pause industrial action, which we are taking reluctantly, but which has got us to the stage where the government says it wants to enter negotiations. We can't do that if we don't know on what grounds they're prepared to negotiate. They have to give us a lot more, and they have to start entering the negotiations, because I have to say, at the moment, trust is not in abundance with this government about their intentions or their their view about how this dispute can be settled. It will only be built if we get around the table. So stop the precondition, get around the table, and let's get negotiating.
At the same time, though, people in the government would say, look, hang on a minute, education was given an additional £2.3 billion in the autumn statement. That's a bigger rise than, lots of other government departments in a time when we know that we're currently spending more on debt than we are on the whole of the schools budget. You're asking for an above-inflation pay rise. Is that really realistic?
Well, we're going to negotiate. I mean, that's our starting position. We will negotiate. We want a good pay rise for teachers because what is realistic? I've just listened to your interview with Bernie Sanders. What's realistic about schools running out of teachers? 1 in 8 maths lessons not being taught by specialists, 1 1/4 physics lessons, the government missing its secondary teacher training targets this year by 41%. Schools are running out of teachers. Now, this country is not going to grow. It's not going to be prosperous if we starve our education service. And the government did put 2.3 billion in, but next year, schools will still, in real terms, only be seeing the funding levels that they saw in 2010. And that statement by Rishi Sunak 2 years ago that he was going to restore funding levels by 2025 to those in 2010 was made before the current round of inflation. That 2.3 billion was necessary just to keep schools open and running. It is not, schools are still starved of funds, and you don't grow the economy and you don't have a successful economy if you don't invest in education. And, when the government says we're investing in education when we can afford to, that's no good for this generation of children. As a society and as a nation, children, as they go through school, whenever they go through school, deserve to be taught by teachers qualified in the subject that they're teaching, deserve to learn in buildings which are not in danger of falling down, and deserve to receive the support they need in order to learn. I don't think, like Bernie Sanders said, that any of these things are outrageous or radical. I think they're the essentials of a democratic and decent society.
OK, we are out of time. Dr. Mary Bousted, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning.